The studio lights glowed like icy suns above the BBC set that morning, casting a pale sheen across the polished desk at the center of the room. It was early, so early that the city outside had not completely shaken off its sleepiness. Yet inside the studio, producers scurried about with clipboards, adjusting microphones, giving whispered instructions, and triple-checking camera angles. Everything looked routine on the surface, but beneath that calm was the simmering mix of tension and anticipation that only live television could produce. None of them knew a simple interview would reshape an entire narrative about a nation. Seated calmly in the middle of this whirlwind was a man who didn't seem to belong in a setting so controlled and high pressure. Daniel Reyes, a Filipino schoolteacher with a quiet presence and a gentle demeanor, waited with his hands folded loosely on the desk. He had flown from a small province in the Philippines to London for a segment on global education, an invitation he had found both strange and flattering. He wasn't a celebrity, he wasn't a politician, he wasn't a best-selling author. He was simply a teacher who believed in the power of learning. That was all. Across from him sat the host, a veteran journalist whose sharp tongue was famous across morning television. She was admired, respected, and occasionally criticized for her bluntness. She greeted viewers with her usual polished charm, her voice crisp and confident. People tuned in because they trusted her to be fearless. And today, she looked ready for another hard-hitting interview. But little did she know, the quiet teacher sitting across from her would not be the easy target she imagined. The interview began smoothly, like most segments did. She breezed through news updates, global headlines, political topics, and cultural features, her pace rapid but controlled. Then she pivoted to the segment involving Daniel. Her smile shifted, still polite, but lined with the subtle stiffness that suggested she was preparing a difficult question. "We've been hearing different opinions about the education systems across the world," she began, turning gracefully toward him. "And many critics insist that some countries, like the Philippines, consistently struggle because their citizens supposedly do not receive the kind of strong education required to compete globally." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Camera operators exchanged quick glances, producers paused mid-step. Even Daniel blinked, not offended but undeniably taken by surprise. The host wasn't finished. "Do you think this is why so many Filipinos leave their country to work abroad instead of becoming industry leaders back home?" The cameras leaned in closer, waiting for Daniel's reaction. Most viewers would expect him to shrink, to look uncomfortable, maybe even to fumble over a defensive explanation. But instead, Daniel smiled. Not in arrogance, not in irritation, but with the calm certainty of a man who knew something others had plainly overlooked. "May I ask a question before I respond?" he said gently. His tone was so composed that it momentarily disarmed the host. Guests rarely countered her with questions. She lifted her eyebrows slightly, intrigued. "Go ahead," she permitted. Daniel leaned forward, not aggressively but with quiet confidence. "Before preparing these questions, did your team review global literacy reports or international education surveys?" A ripple of surprise crossed the host's face. She didn't answer, but Daniel continued with steady composure.
"If anyone had checked, they would know the Philippines consistently ranks among the highest literacy rates in Asia. Not only that, our universities produce thousands of graduates in science, engineering, medicine, and education every year. Many advanced countries depend heavily on Filipino professionals, not because we lack education, but because we excel in roles that require adaptability, skill, and dedication." Behind the cameras, someone mouthed, "Wow!" The host tried to reclaim control. "But your system still faces weaknesses." "Every system faces weaknesses," Daniel said before she could finish. "But outcomes speak louder than systems." He began listing real-world examples, his voice still gentle but undeniably firm. "Filipinos run hospitals, laboratories, IT departments, and research centers around the world. Thousands of nurses from my country keep the UK's medical facilities functioning every single day. Filipino engineers help build skyscrapers in the Middle East. Filipino teachers mentor students across the US and Europe." Then he looked directly into the main camera with a steady gaze. "If Filipinos lacked education, none of this would be possible." The words hit the studio like a quiet explosion. For once, the famously sharp host had no interruption ready. Daniel continued, his sincerity filling every corner of the room. "Education is not measured simply by modern buildings or large budgets," he said. "It is measured by resilience, problem-solving, innovation, and adaptability. Filipinos grow up learning how to maximize limited resources. We learn how to adjust quickly. We learn how to persevere. And those are strengths many countries openly admire, but rarely acknowledge." The host cleared her throat, trying to regain her footing. "So, you're saying the criticism is unfair?" Daniel chuckled softly. I'm saying the criticism is lazy. People make assumptions about Filipinos without understanding the depth of our education, our work ethic, or our global contributions. Then he delivered the line that would later go viral. Filipinos are not uneducated, they are underestimated. The studio fell completely silent. Trying a different angle, the host asked, if the Philippines has such strong education, why do so many Filipinos choose to leave? Daniel didn't hesitate for even a moment. Because opportunities are global. Filipinos go where their skills are needed. That is not a weakness, that is ambition. When someone brings their talent to the world, that is not a loss, it is influence. He went on to explain how many overseas Filipino workers eventually return with new experiences, new skills, and new ideas that strengthen their communities. Migration is not a sign of poor education, he added. It is a sign of a people capable of thriving anywhere.
By this point, online viewers were flooding the broadcast with comments praising him. In the studio, the atmosphere had changed completely. What began as an uncomfortable interrogation had become an enlightening lesson. Toward the end of the interview, Daniel reached into his bag and pulled out organized folders. I brought something for your researchers, he said kindly. These are recent studies from international organizations measuring student performance. These are lists of Filipino scientists and healthcare workers contributing to global initiatives. These are awards Filipino students earned in robotics, mathematics, and engineering competitions. He placed the documents gently on the table. The host, aware that the cameras were still rolling, looked at them with visible humility. I suppose we overlooked some things, she admitted. It happens, Daniel replied. That's why conversations like this are important. They correct misunderstandings. When the network cut to commercial break, the transformation in the studio was immediate. Cameramen nodded at Daniel with admiration. Several producers approached him to shake his hand. Even the host stood up, looking genuinely grateful. Thank you, she whispered, for helping us see the truth. But the story did not end there. The interview spread across social media within hours. Filipinos shared it globally. People from other nations commented, saying they had never realized the extent of Filipino talent and global contribution. Some even apologized in their comments for believing stereotypes. Within a week, the BBC produced a follow-up feature, not on the supposed weaknesses of Philippine education, but on the remarkable achievements of Filipinos worldwide. And they credited Daniel as the man who sparked the conversation. But life had more surprises in store for the quiet teacher. Only days later, Daniel received an email from a major international education foundation. They had watched the interview and were deeply impressed by his calm strength, clarity, and dignity. They invited him to speak at a global education conference in Geneva, where leaders, ministers, researchers, and innovators from over 50 nations would gather. Daniel initially assumed the email was a scam. He reread it at least 5 times before accepting it was genuine. When he arrived in Geneva, he walked into a conference hall filled with diplomats, scholars, and executives. For the first time, he felt truly nervous. This was a stage far bigger than anything he had known. But as he stepped up to the podium, he remembered the millions of Filipinos who had supported him, shared the video, and stood proudly behind him. He began his speech slowly, his voice echoing softly across the sophisticated auditorium. He spoke of students from remote villages who studied under damaged roofs, yet still managed to win global competitions. He spoke of teachers walking long distances just to reach their classrooms. He shared stories of communities with only one computer that still produced future engineers, programmers, and scientists. The room grew silent, not out of boredom, but out of admiration. By the time Daniel finished, the entire hall rose to their feet, giving him a long, heartfelt standing ovation. Delegates from various nations approached afterward, asking if he could advise them on improving their own education systems. Some invited him to visit their countries. Others asked if he would consider training their educators. Daniel was overwhelmed, but he remained humble. "I am not here to show off," he told them. "I am here to remind the world that talent exists everywhere, even in places people underestimate." When he returned home, the airport was crowded with students, teachers, and community members holding banners that read, "You made us proud, Sir Daniel?" But Daniel brushed off the praise with a gentle smile. "I only spoke the truth," he would say. "Filipinos carried the greatness long before I opened my mouth." Soon after, a scholarship fund was named in his honor. Schools invited him to inspire their students. Filipino workers from around the world sent messages thanking him for defending their dignity. For many of them, it was the first time they felt seen, truly seen, on an international stage. Months later, the BBC invited him back. But this time, it wasn't for another interview. It was to present him with an International Education Award. The very same host who once questioned the strength of Filipino education now stood on stage holding a trophy meant to honor him. With sincerity in her voice, she said, "Because of you, the world now sees your people differently." Daniel accepted the award, but he knew it belonged to more than just him. His heart filled with pride, not for himself, but for the millions of Filipinos who had quietly carried excellence across the globe for generations. As applause filled the hall, Daniel realized something profound. Sometimes, all it takes is one calm, courageous voice to correct an entire narrative about a nation. He had walked into that BBC studio as an ordinary teacher. He walked out as a symbol of truth, dignity, and strength. And wherever he went after that day, he carried with him the quiet pride of a people who were never uneducated, only misunderstood, underestimated, and now finally seen. In the months following the ceremony, Daniel's life continued to shift in ways he never could have predicted. As the video of his interview circulated globally, new audiences discovered it almost daily. Individuals who had never thought about education in the Philippines suddenly found themselves exploring stories, reading articles, and sharing posts that showcased the resilience and brilliance of Filipino learners. It startled Daniel to realize that something he had said in less than an hour had sparked such widespread curiosity, but it also filled him with a sense of responsibility that grew heavier and more meaningful as time passed. Organizations from around the world began reaching out. Some invitations asked him to speak. Others asked him to advise on policy. A few wanted him to collaborate on international education campaigns. Every message felt surreal to him, as though he was reading letters from a world he used to imagine only through documentaries and books. Yet each request reminded him of the same truth. The work he had done as a teacher was not small at all. The classroom, he realized, was a far more significant stage than most people acknowledged. Still, he refused to let this new recognition change who he was. Daniel continued to walk to school each morning at the same time, greeting students along the path. He continued marking essays in the evenings, encouraging those who doubted their abilities, offering gentle corrections to those who needed direction. And yet, there was undeniably something different about the way people reacted when he walked through the community. Parents waved at him with newfound admiration. Shop owners greeted him warmly. Students followed him with wide eyes, inspired by the idea that someone from their small town could make such a difference in the world. For many of them, he became a living reminder that greatness could grow from modest soil, as long as it was tended with hope and consistency. One afternoon, as he finished sorting through a pile of student work, a colleague entered the classroom with an envelope. "This came for you," she said, smiling. It had been delivered by a courier. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from an international university consortium inviting him to participate in a global study on rural education resilience. The letter stated that they had reviewed his conference speech, analyzed the data he had presented, and been deeply moved by his personal stories. They wanted him to help design curriculum models that could be used across developing regions, models focused on creativity, adaptability, and community-based learning. They offered to fly him to different countries, introduce him to local educators, and collaborate on long-term solutions for learning in challenging environments. Daniel set the letter down and sat in silence. It wasn't pride he felt, it was something quieter and deeper. He knew that this was the kind of work that could truly reshape lives. But he also knew that accepting such an invitation meant spending time away from his students, away from the classroom where his heart had always belonged. He needed time to think. The next day, he met with his school principal, a wise woman who had supported his career for many years. She listened as Daniel explained the opportunity and the dilemma it created. "Do you feel guilty for stepping away?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Yes," Daniel admitted. "These children depend on me." She took a deep breath. "You have served this community faithfully, and you will continue to serve it, just in a different way. Sometimes, helping many requires stepping beyond what is familiar." He looked at her, searching for reassurance. "Your classroom has expanded, Daniel," she continued. "Your students are no longer only the children sitting at these desks. They are the teachers who look up to you, the parents who believe in education because of you, the communities abroad who are waiting to hear your voice. If you step into this role, you won't be abandoning your classroom. You'll be bringing it to the world." Daniel felt something inside him settle into place. The path forward, though daunting, was clear. He accepted the invitation. Within weeks, Daniel was flying to places he had only seen in textbooks. His first stop was a small village in Kenya, where he spent time with teachers who faced many of the challenges familiar to rural Filipino communities: limited technology, shared materials, and children who walked long distances just for the chance to learn. Yet he also saw creativity, curiosity, and an unbreakable sense of community, qualities that reminded him of home. During his workshops there, he shared methods Filipino teachers use to encourage resourcefulness. The Kenyan educators shared their own techniques. Daniel listened as much as he taught, recognizing that wisdom lived everywhere, often hidden in the quiet routines of unsung heroes. The local teachers learned from him, but he learned from them as well. He carried their stories with him, weaving them into future lectures and presentations. He began to understand education not only as a system, but as a living network of people and ideas that transcended borders. His second trip took him to a coastal region in Indonesia, affected by frequent natural disasters. Schools there had to be rebuilt repeatedly, and children often experienced interruptions to their learning. Daniel worked with officials and teachers to design portable learning kits, lightweight, waterproof bags filled with essential materials that students could take home, or to temporary shelters when classes were disrupted. In return, Indonesian educators taught him strategies for trauma-informed teaching, showing him how they helped children cope emotionally after disasters. These conversations left a profound impact on him. He realized that education was not simply about academics, but about healing, resilience, and rebuilding hope when the world broke apart. By the time Daniel reached his third destination, a mountainous district in Peru, he had become not only a consultant, but a bridge between communities. He advised educators on blended learning strategies, helped train teachers in remote villages, and shared the philosophy that had guided him throughout his life: that learning thrives when it is rooted in dignity, curiosity, and cultural pride. Throughout these travels, Daniel recorded his experiences meticulously. He wrote reports, collected data, and made recommendations. He participated in panel discussions, connected with policymakers, and helped shape international frameworks that placed human experience at the center of learning. Yet every night, no matter where he was, he thought of home. He thought of the simple classrooms with their worn desks, the blackboards with fading chalk marks, the familiar faces of children eager to learn. He remembered the voices of his colleagues discussing lesson plans during lunchtime, the sound of footsteps in the hallways, the soft buzz of excitement when a student finally understood something that once seemed impossible. He missed all of it. Eventually, after months of travel, Daniel returned to the Philippines with new insights, new connections, and new hopes. His community welcomed him back warmly. Students ran toward him, full of questions about the world. Teachers congratulated him. Neighbors embraced him with pride. But Daniel had changed. He had seen what was possible when people believed deeply in the value of education. He had witnessed the universal desire of children, whether in Asia, Africa, or South America, to learn, dream, and build lives of meaning. He realized that one voice, used wisely, could strengthen many others. And so, Daniel decided to establish a program that connected Filipino teachers with educators worldwide. Through online forums, cultural exchanges, and collaborative projects, he created a platform where knowledge flowed freely across borders. Teachers shared strategies for handling classroom challenges, adapting lessons for limited resources, and using creativity to transform ordinary objects into learning tools. The initiative grew rapidly. Universities took notice. NGOs offered support. Government agencies expressed interest. Soon, the platform became a global network linking thousands of teachers who believed in the same vision, that education should uplift, unite, and empower. As his influence expanded, Daniel remained humble. Despite invitations to speak at high-profile events, he always prioritized returning to his community. He believed that any leader who forgot their roots risked losing their purpose. And so, even after long trips abroad, he found time to walk through familiar hallways, greet students, and sit with teachers who wanted to share their concerns or dreams. One day, a small girl approached him after class. She held a notebook pressed tightly to her chest and looked very nervous. "Sir Daniel," she whispered, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," he said gently. She looked down at her shoes. "How did you become brave?" The question struck him deeply because he had never thought of himself as brave. He thought of himself as someone who simply told the truth. But to this young student, truth-telling was an act of courage. He knelt so they were at eye level. "I am not brave," he said softly. "I am just honest. And honesty can feel like bravery when people are used to hearing something else." She nodded slowly, absorbing each word. "But if you want to be brave," he continued, "start by being curious. Ask questions, learn deeply, understand your worth. When you know who you are, it becomes easier to speak, even when others doubt you." The girl smiled and clutched her notebook to her heart before running off to join her friends. Moments like that reminded Daniel why he chose this path. Years passed, and Daniel's work continued to ripple outward. He was invited to speak at summits and universities. He collaborated with government leaders on education reforms. He helped design programs for remote communities. The scholarship fund in his name expanded. Dozens, then hundreds of students received help each year. Yet through all of it, he never forgot the interview that started everything. He never forgot the room lit by studio lights, the quiet shock on the presenter's face, or the question that gave birth to the truth he had spoken. Did you check the facts? It was a reminder that prejudice often grows not from malice, but from ignorance, and can be undone by clarity, humility, and courage. Eventually, Daniel was invited to return once more to the BBC studio where everything began. As he entered the familiar hallway, memories washed over him. But this time, he was not there to defend his country. He was there to reflect on the changes that had unfolded across the world because of a single conversation. The presenter greeted him warmly, a genuine smile on her face. She thanked him for the growth she herself had undergone since their last encounter. And as they sat across from each other once again, she asked a very different question. What have you learned since that day? Daniel looked around the studio, the lights, the cameras, the faces waiting for his answer, and he took a slow breath. I learned, he said, that people become kinder when they are informed. I learned that entire nations can be misunderstood for decades until someone finally explains the truth. I learned that humility is a strength, not a weakness. And I learned that people are extraordinary everywhere, not just in places the world highlights. The presenter nodded thoughtfully. And what do you hope comes next? She asked. Daniel smiled. More curiosity, he replied. Less assumption, more listening. Less judging. If we did those simple things, the world would already be a kinder place. The interview concluded. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, but Daniel barely heard it. He was thinking of the countless teachers, students, families, and workers who had fueled his journey. He walked out of the studio into the sunlight, feeling a deep sense of peace. He had begun as a teacher. He remained a teacher. Only now, the world was his classroom, and the lessons he shared carried the voices of millions.